The evening sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Vienna Conservatory of Music. Maria Rodriguez pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway, her worn shoes making soft squeaking sounds with each step. She had been working at this grand building for 3 years now, and every day felt the same. Clean the practice rooms, mop the floors, dust the expensive instruments. Go home tired, but tonight was different. Tonight her son Carlos was with her. The boy walked quietly beside his mother, carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies. He was 16 years old, thin and tall, with dark hair that fell across his forehead. His clothes were old and patched in several places, but they were clean. Maria made sure of that. No matter how poor they were, she insisted on cleanliness and dignity. Carlos loved coming to the conservatory with his mother. He loved it more than anything else in the world. Not because he enjoyed cleaning, but because of the music. Every evening when he arrived, the building was alive with sound. Piano music poured from every practice room. Violins sang in distant corners. Sometimes he could hear a full orchestra rehearsing in the main hall. The conservatory was a place where rich families sent their talented children to study music. The students here wore fine clothes and carried expensive instrument cases. They spoke confidently and walked with their heads held high. They barely noticed the cleaning woman and her son. To them, Maria and Carlos were invisible, just part of the furniture. Maria entered the first practice room and began cleaning. Carlos helped her empty the trash bins and wipe down the music stands. Through the wall they could hear a young woman practicing scales on a piano. The notes went up and down, over and over again. "Mama, can I ask you something?" Carlos said quietly. Maria looked at her son. She saw the familiar look in his eyes, the one that meant he was thinking about music again. "What is it, mijo? Do you think I could ever learn to play like that?" Maria's heart ached. This was not the first time Carlos had asked such questions. She set down her cleaning cloth and touched her son's cheek gently. "Oh, my sweet boy, music lessons cost money we do not have. The piano teachers here charge more for one lesson than I earn in a month." "I know, Mama. I was just wondering." They continued cleaning in silence, but Maria could see that her son's mind was far away, lost in dreams of music. The truth was that Carlos had been teaching himself. Maria did not know this, but every night after they finished cleaning, Carlos would sneak back into one of the practice rooms. He would sit at the piano and try to copy the sounds he had heard earlier. His fingers would search for the right keys, making mistakes over and over until he found the notes he wanted. He had been doing this for almost 2 years now. Carlos had learned to be very quiet. He would take off his shoes so his footsteps would not echo in the empty halls. He would play softly, barely pressing the keys so the sound would not travel far, and he always listened carefully for any sound of approaching footsteps. If someone came, he would slip away like a shadow. Tonight, as they moved from room to room cleaning, Carlos listened carefully to everything. In one room, a young man was struggling with a difficult piece by Chopin. He kept stopping and starting, cursing in frustration. In another room, a girl played Mozart with perfect technique but no feeling, as if she were a machine programmed to hit the right notes. In the largest practice room, a group of students had gathered. They were talking excitedly about something. Maria and Carlos could hear them through the door. "Is it true?" one student asked. "Is Victor Hoffman really coming tonight?" "Yes, my father confirmed it," another replied. "He is giving a special master class for the advanced students. Only the best are invited to play for him. I am so nervous. What if he hates my playing? Everyone says he is very harsh. He made a student cry last time he was in Berlin." Carlos stopped cleaning. Victor Hoffman. He knew that name. Everyone who loved music knew that name. Victor Hoffman was one of the greatest pianists in all of Europe. He had played in the finest concert halls from London to Moscow. People paid enormous amounts of money to hear him perform, and he was coming here. Tonight. Maria noticed her son had frozen in place. "Carlos, what is wrong? We have work to do." "Mama, did you hear? Victor Hoffman is coming." "The famous pianist," Maria frowned. "That means we must work faster. They will want all the rooms perfect before he arrives. Come, we have much to do." They hurried through their cleaning tasks. All around them, the conservatory was buzzing with excitement. Students rushed back and forth, carrying sheet music and fixing their clothes. The conservatory director, Herr Schmidt, was barking orders at everyone. He was a short man with a round belly and a gray beard. He wore an expensive suit and always looked irritated about something. "The main hall must be spotless," Herr Schmidt shouted. "Fresh flowers on the stage. Make sure every piano is perfectly tuned. Herr Hoffman will be here within the hour. Maria grabbed her son's arm. We must clean the main hall now, quickly. They rushed to the main hall with their cleaning supplies. It was a beautiful room with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. At one end of the room sat a magnificent grand piano, black and shining like a jewel. The piano was worth more money than Maria would earn in her entire lifetime. Carlos stared at the piano as he swept the floor. He had never been this close to it before. The cleaning staff were usually not allowed near the expensive instruments. But tonight, in the rush to prepare for Victor Hoffman, no one was paying attention to what Maria and her son were doing. Be careful around that piano, Maria whispered to Carlos. Do not even breathe on it too hard. If you damage it, we will be thrown out immediately. Carlos nodded, but he could not take his eyes off the beautiful instrument. His fingers ached to touch those keys. He wondered what it would feel like to play on such a perfect piano. All his secret practice had been on old, out-of-tune instruments in the back practice rooms. But this piano must sound like heaven itself. Students began filling the main hall. They sat in the rows of chairs, whispering nervously to each other. Some held sheet music, preparing for their chance to play for the great maestro. Others came just to watch and learn. Maria and Carlos finished their cleaning and started to leave, but Herr Schmidt stopped them. You two stay in the back corner. We may need you to clean up quickly if anyone spills something. But stay out of sight and stay silent. I do not want the maestro disturbed by the help. So Maria and Carlos stood in the shadows at the back of the hall. Carlos was happy. This meant he would get to see Victor Hoffman in person. He would get to hear the great pianist speak about music. A few minutes later, the hall fell silent. Everyone stopped talking and turned toward the door. A man entered the room. Victor Hoffman was tall and thin, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. He wore a perfect black suit and carried himself like royalty. He was probably 60 years old, but he moved with the grace of a much younger man. His face was stern, with deep lines around his mouth that suggested he did not smile often. The maestro walked to the front of the hall without greeting anyone. He sat in a chair facing the grand piano and looked at the gathered students with an expression that might have been boredom or disappointment. Herr Schmidt rushed forward, bowing slightly. Herr Hoffman, we are so honored by your presence. Our finest students are prepared to play for you. They have been practicing for weeks. Victor Hoffman waved his hand dismissively. Yes, let us begin. I have another appointment later tonight. The first student approached the piano nervously. She was a girl of about 18, wearing an expensive blue dress. Her hands trembled as she arranged her sheet music. She began to play a piece by Schubert. Carlos listened intently from his corner. The girl played well. Her technique was good and she made very few mistakes. But Victor Hoffman stopped her after only 2 minutes. Enough, he said coldly. You play the notes correctly, but you do not understand what you are playing. Schubert wrote this piece about loss and longing. You play it like you are reading a shopping list. Next. The girl's face turned red. She gathered her music and hurried back to her seat, tears in her eyes. The next student played Beethoven. Victor Hoffman let him finish, but his critique was even harsher. Technically adequate, emotionally dead. You have learned the notes, but you have not learned the music. Next. One after another, students played for the maestro. One after another, he dismissed them with cutting comments. Some he stopped after only a few measures. Others he allowed to finish before destroying their confidence with his words. Carlos watched and listened to everything. He noticed things that the maestro was saying. It was not enough to play the notes correctly. You had to feel the music. You had to understand what the composer was trying to say. Music was not just sound. It was emotion and story and human experience. In the back corner, Maria was worried. She could see the expression on her son's face. She knew that look. Carlos was not just watching. He was learning. He was imagining himself at that piano. Stop thinking such thoughts, she whispered to him. That world is not for people like us. But Carlos barely heard her. His whole attention was focused on the piano and the music and Victor Hoffman's words. After about an hour, the masterclass was finished. Victor Hoffman stood up and addressed the students. You are all technically proficient. Your parents have paid for excellent instruction, but most of you will never be true musicians. You play music the way a carpenter builds a table, following instructions without inspiration. True music comes from the soul, not from the fingers. He paused and looked around the room with those sharp blue eyes. Perhaps one or two of you have the potential for greatness, but potential means nothing without passion, and passion cannot be taught. With that, Victor Hoffman turned and walked toward the door, but then he stopped and patted his pockets. He frowned and turned around. I have left my pocket watch. Give me a moment. He walked back toward the front of the hall, searching around his chair. The students began talking among themselves, discussing the harsh master class. Herr Schmidt followed Victor Hoffman, apologizing for something. Maria saw her chance. Come, Carlos. We can leave now while everyone is distracted. We will go home. They slipped out of the main hall and into the corridor, but then Carlos stopped walking. Mama, I need to use the bathroom. I will meet you at the front door in 5 minutes. Maria was tired and wanted to go home, but she nodded. 5 minutes, no more. We have a long walk home. Carlos hurried away, but he did not go to the bathroom. He went back toward the main hall. His heart was pounding in his chest. He knew he should not do what he was thinking of doing. It was crazy. It was dangerous. His mother would be furious. They could both lose everything, but something inside him was stronger than fear or common sense. It was a hunger that had been growing for years, a need that he could not ignore any longer. The main hall was nearly empty now. Most of the students had left, disappointed and upset by Victor Hoffman's harsh words. Herr Schmidt was walking the maestro toward a side door, discussing something about dinner arrangements. Carlos slipped into the hall and moved toward the grand piano like a magnet pulled to iron. His heart felt like it would burst from his chest. His hands were shaking. He reached out and touched the piano keys. They were cool and smooth under his fingertips. Beautiful. He pressed down on one key very gently. A single note rang out, pure and perfect. It was the most beautiful sound Carlos had ever heard in his life. He pressed another key, and another. He was so lost in the moment that he did not hear footsteps approaching from behind him. What do you think you are doing, boy? The voice was cold and sharp as a knife. Carlos spun around and found himself staring into the face of Victor Hoffman. The great pianist stood 3 feet away, his eyes blazing with anger. Carlos opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind went blank with terror. Victor Hoffman stepped closer. I asked you a question. What are you doing touching this piano? Do you have any idea what this instrument is worth? It is worth more than your family earns in a lifetime. The maestro's voice had risen. Other people heard and came running. Students peered in through the doorway. Herr Schmidt rushed over, his face turning purple with rage. You! The director shouted, pointing at Carlos. How dare you? Where is your mother? I will have you both thrown out immediately. Guards Maria appeared in the doorway. When she saw her son standing at the piano with all these angry people surrounding him, her face went pale. She rushed forward. I am so sorry, so sorry. Please, he is just a boy. He meant no harm. Carlos, come away from there right now. She grabbed her son's arm, trying to pull him away, but Carlos planted his feet and did not move. Something had changed inside him at that moment. All his life he had been invisible. All his life he had accepted his place in the shadows. But standing there at that beautiful piano, with the greatest pianist in Europe staring at him, something broke free inside Carlos Rodriguez. He looked directly into Victor Hoffman's eyes and spoke. His voice shook, but it was clear. With respect, Herr Hoffman, I believe I can play anything you just heard tonight. For a moment, there was complete silence in the hall. Then someone laughed. Another person joined in. Soon the entire room was filled with laughter. Students who had been dismissed by Victor Hoffman were now laughing at the poor cleaning woman's son, who dared to claim he could play piano. Maria was mortified. She pulled harder on her son's arm. Carlos, stop this nonsense. Apologize right now. But Victor Hoffman held up his hand. The laughter stopped. The maestro studied Carlos with a strange expression, somewhere between amusement and curiosity. You believe you can play? Victor Hoffman said slowly. You? A boy who probably cannot even read music think you can play piano like my trained students? I can try, sir, Carlos said. His voice was stronger now. Victor Hoffman smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a cat that has cornered a mouse. Very well, boy. I will give you a chance. Play for me Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the third movement. If you can complete even the first page without mistakes, I will personally give your mother a month's wages. But when you fail, and you will fail, you and your mother will leave this building and never return. Herr Schmidt, you agree to these terms? The director nodded eagerly. Oh yes, absolutely. This boy has no business here anyway. Maria was crying now. Please, Carlos, do not do this. Let us just go home. But Carlos gently pulled his arm free from his mother's grasp. He looked at her with love and sadness. I am sorry, Mama, but I have to do this. I have to try. He turned back to the piano and sat down on the bench. More people were crowding into the hall now, drawn by the commotion. Word had spread quickly that the cleaning woman's son was about to make a fool of himself trying to play for Victor Hoffman. Carlos looked down at the piano keys. His hands were shaking so badly he wondered if he would be able to play at all. The third movement of the Moonlight Sonata was one of the most difficult pieces ever written. It was fast and furious and demanded incredible technical skill. He had taught himself this piece by listening to students practice it. He had played it dozens of times on old pianos late at night when no one was around. But he had never played it on a piano like this. And he had never played it in front of anyone, let alone in front of Victor Hoffman and a room full of people who wanted to see him fail. Carlos closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. He thought about all the nights he had spent in this building, listening through walls, teaching himself in secret. He thought about his mother, working so hard to give him any kind of life at all. He thought about the music that had lived inside him for as long as he could remember, the music that demanded to be released. He opened his eyes. He raised his hands to the keyboard, and he began to play. The first notes rang out into the silent hall. They were tentative and soft, like a question being asked. Carlos's fingers touched the keys carefully, as if he were afraid they might burn him. But as the opening measures of the third movement began to take shape, something started to change. The third movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata is called Presto agitato, which means fast and agitated. It is a storm of notes, a fury of sound that seems to come from some dark and troubled place in the soul. It requires the pianist to move their fingers at incredible speed while maintaining control and expressing the deep emotion of the piece. Carlos played the opening phrases, and his hands began to remember. They remembered all those nights of secret practice. They remembered the feel of the keys under his fingers, the way certain passages required you to stretch your hand in uncomfortable ways, the places where you had to leap from one end of the keyboard to the other. But more than that, Carlos remembered the feeling of the music. He had listened to this piece hundreds of times. He had heard it played well and played poorly. He had heard students struggle with the technical demands and miss the emotional heart. And late at night, alone in the practice rooms, he had found his own way into the music. The crowd that had gathered to watch him fail began to grow quiet. The laughter died away. People stopped whispering to each other. Even Victor Hoffman, who had been standing with his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face, slowly lowered his arms to his sides. Carlos was not playing perfectly. His technique was rough in places. He had taught himself without proper instruction, and it showed. His fingering was inefficient. His posture was not quite right. There were moments when his fingers fumbled slightly, when he hit a note that was close to correct but not exactly right. But something else was happening that no one in that room could deny. Carlos was not just playing notes. He was releasing something that had been locked inside him for years. Every note carried weight. Every phrase had meaning. His hands moved across the keyboard with a kind of desperate passion, as if he were telling a story that he had been forbidden to tell his whole life. The music filled the hall. It was Beethoven's fury and darkness, but it was also Carlos's own hunger and longing. It was the frustration of watching others do what you dream of doing. It was the pain of being invisible, of being told that certain things are not for people like you. It was the defiance of refusing to accept those limitations. Maria stood against the wall with tears streaming down her face. She covered her mouth with both hands. She had no idea her son could do this. She had known he loved music, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Where had he learned this? When had he practiced? The students who had laughed were now staring with their mouths open. Some of them had been studying piano for 10 years or more. They had the best teachers money could buy. They practiced for hours every day in perfect conditions. And yet this boy, this poor cleaning woman's son in his patched clothes, was playing with a raw power and emotion that made their own playing seem hollow in comparison. Herr Schmidt's face had gone from purple with anger to white with shock. He gripped the back of a chair, watching in disbelief. But the most remarkable change was in Victor Hoffman. The great maestro had moved closer to the piano. He was watching Carlos's hands with an expression of intense concentration. His sharp blue eyes followed every movement, analyzed every phrase. The smug smile was completely gone, replaced by something that might have been surprise or recognition, or even respect. Carlos reached the climactic section of the piece, where the music builds to a tremendous emotional peak. His whole body was involved now, swaying slightly as he played, his face showing the strain and the ecstasy of the moment. Sweat appeared on his forehead. His fingers flew across the keys faster than seemed humanly possible, and then suddenly it was over. The final crashing chords rang out and faded into silence. Carlos sat motionless at the piano, his hands still hovering over the keys, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He stared down at the keyboard as if he could not quite believe what had just happened. The silence in the hall was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone had forgotten how to make sound. Finally, Victor Hoffman broke the silence. He walked slowly toward the piano, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. Carlos turned on the bench to look up at him, and for the first time since he had started playing, fear returned to his eyes. The maestro stopped a few feet away and studied Carlos's face for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was very quiet. "Who taught you?" Carlos swallowed hard. "No one, sir. Only the music itself." Victor Hoffman's eyebrows rose slightly. "You taught yourself?" "How?" "I listen, sir. When I am here with my mother, I listen to the students practice. And then at night, when everyone is gone, I try to copy what I heard. I have been doing this for 2 years. 2 years, Victor Hoffman repeated. He shook his head slowly as if he could not quite process this information. Then he turned to face the gathered crowd. His voice became louder, more forceful. "Do you hear that? This boy with no training, with no teachers, with no advantages at all, understands something that most of you will never grasp. Technique without soul is merely noise. Perfection without passion is death." He turned back to Carlos. "Your form is terrible. Your fingering is inefficient. You made at least a dozen mistakes that I counted. Some notes were not quite right. Your posture is wrong, and you will hurt your wrists if you continue to play like that." Carlos's heart sank. He had failed after all. The room began to spin slightly, and he gripped the edge of the piano bench to steady himself. But Victor Hoffman was not finished. "However, you have something that cannot be taught. You hear the music's heart. You understand what Beethoven was trying to say. Most of these students," he gestured toward the crowd, "can play the notes more accurately than you, but they play like machines, like trained monkeys hitting keys on command. You play like a musician." The maestro paused, letting his words sink in. Then he asked, "What other pieces do you know?" Carlos blinked in surprise. "Sir, what other pieces have you taught yourself? Play something else for me." Carlos's mind raced. He knew dozens of pieces, but he had never expected to be asked this question. I know some Chopin, and Mozart, and some Liszt, though I do not play those as well." "Play the Chopin. Which nocturne do you know?" "Nocturne in E-flat major, opus 9, number 2, sir." "Then play it now." Carlos turned back to the piano. His hands were still shaking, but now it was from excitement rather than fear. He placed his fingers on the keys and began the gentle, flowing melody of the Chopin nocturne. This was a completely different kind of music from the Beethoven. Where the Moonlight Sonata was storm and fury, the Chopin was moonlight and dreams. It required a delicate touch and a deep sensitivity to phrasing and dynamics. It was not about technical fireworks. It was about beauty and emotion in their most refined form. Carlos played it with tenderness and longing. Again, his technique was flawed. There were moments when his timing was not quite right, when a trill was a bit rough, when the balance between melody and accompaniment was imperfect, but the emotional truth of the piece shone through every note. He played it like someone singing a love song to something they could never have. When he finished, Victor Hoffman simply nodded. "Mozart now. Play something by Mozart." For the next hour, Carlos played piece after piece at the maestro's request, sonatas and preludes and etudes. Each time, Victor Hoffman listened intently, sometimes stopping Carlos to ask questions. "Why did you slow down there?" "Because it felt right, sir. The melody is sad in that part." "And why did you make that chord louder than the others?" "Because it is the turning point. That is where everything changes." "How do you know it changes?" "I can hear it in the notes. The harmonies shift. Beethoven is telling you that something important is happening. Victor Hoffman would nod, ask another question, then instruct Carlos to play something else. The crowd remained, transfixed by this strange examination. No one wanted to leave. They had come expecting to see a fool humiliate himself. Instead, they were witnessing something extraordinary, though most of them did not fully understand what it was. Maria had stopped crying, but she remained pressed against the wall, afraid to move or speak. She kept thinking this must be a dream. Soon she would wake up in their tiny apartment, and this would all be revealed as fantasy. Herr Schmidt stood to the side, his expression confused and angry. He did not like where this seemed to be heading. This boy had no place in his prestigious conservatory. Rules were rules. Standards were standards. You could not just let any poor street child wander in and start playing the pianos. Finally, after Carlos had played his way through much of his self-taught repertoire, Victor Hoffman held up his hand. Enough. I have heard sufficient. Carlos stopped playing and turned to face the maestro. He was exhausted. His hands ached. His mind was spinning, but he felt more alive than he had ever felt in his life. Victor Hoffman looked at Herr Schmidt. Director, I have a proposal to make. Herr Schmidt stepped forward nervously. Yes, Herr Hoffman? I will personally sponsor this boy's education. He will study here at this conservatory, under my direct supervision, full scholarship, room and board if needed. Books, instrument access, everything. The hall erupted in chaos. Students gasped and began talking all at once. Some were outraged. How could this poor boy be given such an opportunity when they had worked so hard? Others were excited, recognizing that they were witnessing something historic. Herr Schmidt's face turned purple again. But Herr Hoffman, the director sputtered, that is simply not possible. We have protocols. We have standards. This boy has no formal training. He cannot even read music properly, I would guess. How can we admit someone like that? What would the other families say? They pay considerable tuition for their children to study here. They would be outraged if we simply gave a free place to a poor boy. Victor Hoffman's voice was cold. To someone who actually has talent rather than just wealthy parents? Let me make myself clear, Director Schmidt. Either this boy studies here under my supervision, or I will withdraw my patronage from this institution entirely. I will take my master classes elsewhere. I will recommend to all my colleagues that they do the same. I will make it known throughout Europe that the Vienna Conservatory is more interested in money than in music. Herr Schmidt's face went from purple to white. Victor Hoffman's patronage was incredibly valuable. His name brought prestige to the conservatory. Students came here because Hoffman occasionally taught master classes. Wealthy families donated money because they wanted their children to have the possibility of learning from the great maestro. But surely we can discuss this privately, Herr Schmidt said weakly. There must be some compromise we can reach. There is no compromise, Victor Hoffman said firmly. The boy studies here or I leave. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Send your answer to my hotel. He turned to Carlos and Maria. The mother and son stood together now, Maria's hand gripping her son's arm tightly. Both of them looked overwhelmed and frightened. You, boy, what is your name? Carlos Rodriguez, sir. Carlos Rodriguez. You will report here tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Bring nothing but yourself. If Director Schmidt agrees to my terms, you will begin your studies immediately. If he refuses, we will make other arrangements. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Carlos whispered. And you? Victor Hoffman turned to Maria. You are the boy's mother? Yes, sir. I'm Maria Rodriguez. Your son has a gift. It is raw and unformed, but it is real. With proper training, he could become a truly great musician. I have not seen potential like this in many years. But the path will be difficult. He will have to work harder than he has ever worked in his life. There will be many who resent him for the opportunity he is being given. He will face prejudice and cruelty. Are you prepared for that? Maria looked at her son. Carlos met her eyes and she saw the hope burning there. It was a hope so bright and fierce that it almost frightened her. But she also saw determination. Her son had lived in the shadows his whole life, but he was ready to step into the light no matter what it cost. We are prepared, sir, Maria said quietly. Victor Hoffman nodded. Good. Then I will see you tomorrow morning, Carlos Rodriguez. Do not be late. The maestro collected his pocket watch from where it had been found near his chair. put on his coat, and walked out of the hall without another word. The crowd parted to let him through, then immediately burst into excited conversation. Students surrounded Carlos and Maria. Some wanted to congratulate Carlos. Others wanted to touch him, as if his sudden good fortune might be contagious. A few looked at him with obvious jealousy and resentment. Herr Schmidt stood alone, his face unreadable. He was clearly calculating the costs and benefits of accepting Victor Hoffman's ultimatum. Finally, he called out loudly, "Everyone out! The conservatory is closed for tonight. All of you, go home." People began to filter out slowly, still talking and glancing back at Carlos. Maria took her son's hand and led him toward the door. They walked through the marble hallways in silence, both of them too stunned to speak. When they stepped outside into the cool night air, Carlos finally found his voice. "Mama, did that really happen? Or am I dreaming?" Maria stopped walking and put both hands on her son's shoulders. She looked into his eyes. "It happened, mijo. It really happened. You played for Victor Hoffman and he saw your gift." Tears started flowing down her cheeks again. "I am so proud of you. And your father, if he were still alive, would be proud too." They walked home through the dark streets of Vienna, neither of them caring that it was late or that they had a long way to go. Their tiny apartment had never felt so far away, but it also had never felt so much like they were walking toward a future instead of away from one. Carlos kept looking at his hands, flexing his fingers, hardly believing they had done what they had done. He had played on the grand piano. He had played for Victor Hoffman. And somehow, impossibly, his life had changed forever in a single evening. But as they walked, a small worry began to grow in his mind. "Mama, what if Herr Schmidt refuses? What if he says no?" Maria squeezed her son's hand. "Then we will find another way. But I think he will say yes. Men like him care about money and prestige above all else. Victor Hoffman's name brings both. He will not want to lose that," she was right. The next morning, when Carlos arrived at the conservatory at exactly 9 o'clock, Herr Schmidt was waiting for him with a forced smile and an enrollment contract. Carlos Rodriguez, the cleaning woman's son, was now officially a student at the Vienna Conservatory of Music. The first few weeks were the hardest of Carlos's life. Harder than all the nights he had taught himself piano in secret. Harder than all the years of watching other children have opportunities he could only dream about. Harder than anything he had ever experienced. Victor Hoffman had not exaggerated when he said the path would be difficult. Carlos arrived at the conservatory that first day wearing his best clothes, which were still shabby compared to what the other students wore. Herr Schmidt had given him a schedule, a locker, and a practice room assignment. Then he had left Carlos standing alone in the hallway, unsure where to go or what to do. Other students passed by him, whispering and pointing. Some looked curious. Most looked hostile. By the end of that first day, Carlos understood why. He was an outsider who had been given something they felt he had not earned. He had skipped all the auditions, all the entrance requirements, all the normal procedures. He was there because Victor Hoffman wanted him there, and for no other reason. "It is not fair," Carlos overheard a girl saying to her friends. "My family paid thousands for my audition preparation. We hired the best teachers. I practiced 6 hours a day for 2 years to get accepted here. And this street boy just walks in because Hoffman felt sorry for him." Another student, a young man named Friedrich, was more direct. He cornered Carlos in the practice hallway on the second day. "You do not belong here, Rodriguez. Everyone knows you are only here because you made a spectacle of yourself. Hoffman will lose interest in you soon enough, and then you will be thrown out. You are nothing but a charity case." Carlos said nothing. He walked away and locked himself in his assigned practice room. He sat at the piano and cried for 10 minutes. Then he dried his tears and began to practice. Victor Hoffman had given Carlos a training program that was brutal in its intensity. Every morning at 6, Carlos had to be in the maestro's private studio for a 2-hour lesson. These lessons were nothing like the gentle encouragement Carlos had imagined. Victor Hoffman was demanding, harsh, and accepted nothing less than complete effort. "Your hand position is terrible," Hoffman would say, pushing Carlos's wrists into the correct angle. "If you continue like this, you will develop injuries that will end your career before it begins." Again, from the beginning. Carlos would start the piece again, trying to remember everything he was supposed to do. Keep his wrists straight, curve his fingers properly, use the weight of his arm, not just the strength of his fingers. Think about the phrase, not just the notes. Feel the music, but control it. Express emotion, but maintain precision. It was overwhelming. There were so many things to think about at once. Carlos had spent 2 years teaching himself, and in those 2 years he had developed many bad habits. Now Victor Hoffman was tearing down everything Carlos thought he knew and rebuilding it from the foundation. "You have natural musicality," Hoffman told him during one particularly frustrating lesson. "That is your gift. But natural talent only takes you so far. The rest is discipline, technique, and years of hard work. You must be willing to tear yourself apart and rebuild yourself as a true musician. Are you willing to do that?" "Yes, sir," Carlos said, though his hands ached and his head pounded from the effort of concentrating so intensely. "Then prove it." Again from the beginning. "And this time, pay attention to the dynamics in measure 43. You are playing everything at the same volume. Music is not a flat line. It is peaks and valleys. It is breath and space and shape." Again. After the morning lesson with Victor Hoffman, Carlos had theory classes. These were a nightmare. Carlos had taught himself to play by ear, but he had never properly learned to read music. He could recognize basic notes and rhythms, but the other students were far ahead of him. They could sight-read complex scores. They understood harmony and counterpoint and musical structure at a level Carlos could not even imagine. The theory teacher, Professor Adler, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and no patience for students who could not keep up. "Rodriguez, you are holding back the entire class. How can you not know what a diminished seventh chord is? This is elementary material." Carlos felt his face burn with shame as the other students snickered. He stayed after class to ask Professor Adler for extra help, but the professor simply sighed. "I do not have time to teach you what you should have learned years ago. You will have to figure it out on your own. I suggest you spend less time showing off at the piano and more time studying your fundamentals." So Carlos studied. He studied until his eyes hurt from reading. He borrowed textbooks from the library and worked through them page by page, teaching himself music theory the same way he had taught himself to play. Late at night, while other students were sleeping or socializing, Carlos was hunched over a desk, drawing staff lines and practicing intervals and memorizing the circle of fifths. His mother still worked at the conservatory, cleaning the same halls where her son now walked as a student. This created an awkward situation. Some students made cruel comments when they saw Maria pushing her cleaning cart. "Hey, Rodriguez, is it true your mother cleans toilets here? Does she clean your practice room too?" I heard his mother begged Hoffman to take him. "She probably offers to clean his house for free." Carlos learned to ignore these comments, though each one cut like a knife. Maria tried to avoid being seen during the hours when students were around, but sometimes it was unavoidable. When Carlos saw his mother in the hallways, they would exchange a brief look, and Maria would give him a small encouraging smile before continuing with her work. The other students were not the only problem. The teachers, with the exception of Victor Hoffman, treated Carlos with barely concealed contempt. They saw him as an unqualified student who had been forced upon them. They were harder on him than on anyone else, criticizing his every mistake, never offering encouragement. But slowly, gradually, Carlos began to improve. The brutal morning lessons with Victor Hoffman were transforming his playing. His technique became cleaner. His hand position improved. He learned to control his dynamics, to shape phrases properly, to balance melody and accompaniment. The theory classes remained difficult, but Carlos's desperate studying was paying off. He started to understand the underlying structure of the music he loved. He began to see patterns and relationships that he had only felt intuitively before. His knowledge was still far behind the other students, but the gap was closing. 3 months into his studies, something happened that changed the dynamic at the conservatory. Victor Hoffman announced that he would be giving a recital at the Vienna Concert Hall, one of the most prestigious venues in the city. This was a major event. Tickets were expensive and sold out within days. All the students at the conservatory would be attending. 2 days before the recital, Victor Hoffman called Carlos to his studio for their morning lesson. But when Carlos arrived, the maestro was not at the piano. He was standing by the window looking out at the city. "Carlos, come here," Hoffman said without turning around. Carlos approached nervously. He had learned to read Victor Hoffman's moods, and something was different today. "I have a question for you," Hoffman said. "In these 3 months, you have worked harder than any student I have ever taught. You arrive early. You stay late. You never complain. Despite facing hostility from your classmates and teachers. Why? What drives you? Carlos thought carefully before answering. The music, sir. I need it the way I need air to breathe. When I play, I feel like I am fully alive, like I am the person I was meant to be. Victor Hoffman nodded slowly. Good, that's the right answer. A musician who plays for fame or money or to please others will never be great. You must play because you cannot imagine doing anything else. He turned to face Carlos. I am going to do something unprecedented. At my recital in 2 days, I am going to perform a duet. I will play the secondo part on one piano, and you will play the primo part on another. We will perform Mozart's sonata for 2 pianos in D major. Carlos felt his legs go weak. Sir, I am not ready for something like that. I have never performed for an audience before. I will make mistakes. I will embarrass you. You will make mistakes, Victor Hoffman agreed calmly. You are not yet a polished performer. But that is not why I am doing this. I am doing this to show the world what potential looks like. I am doing this to prove to all the skeptics that natural talent, when combined with hard work, can achieve remarkable things in just a few months. But sir, what if I fail? What if I freeze on stage? What if Carlos, Hoffman interrupted gently. Do you remember what you did 3 months ago? You walked up to a piano in front of hostile strangers and played your heart out. You had everything to lose and nothing to gain. Yet you did it anyway. This is no different. I will be beside you. We will make music together. Trust yourself. For the next 2 days, Carlos barely slept. He and Victor Hoffman rehearsed the Mozart duet for hours at a time. It was a joyful, playful piece that required the 2 pianists to work in perfect synchronization. Their parts intertwined, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in dialogue, like 2 friends having an animated conversation. Victor Hoffman was a completely different person during these rehearsals. The harsh, critical teacher disappeared, replaced by an enthusiastic partner who clearly loved the music. He smiled when Carlos played something well. Maria sat in the front row, wearing a simple black dress that was the nicest thing she owned. Victor Hoffman had personally given her a ticket and insisted she sit where she could see her son clearly. She looked nervous enough to be sick, but also fiercely proud. Carlos waited backstage, trying to control his breathing. He wore new clothes that Victor Hoffman had purchased for him, a proper black suit and shiny shoes. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back at him. Friedrich, the student who had been cruelest to Carlos, was also backstage. He had been chosen to turn pages for some of Victor Hoffman's solo pieces. When he saw Carlos, he sneered. Ready to humiliate yourself in front of the whole city, Rodriguez? Do not worry, we will all applaud politely when you fail. We would not want to embarrass Hoffman by showing our real feelings. Carlos turned away without responding. He had learned that engaging with Friedrich only made things worse. Victor Hoffman appeared, looking calm and elegant in his performance attire. He placed a hand on Carlos's shoulder. Are you ready? I am terrified, sir. Good. A little fear sharpens the mind. Just remember what we practiced. Listen to me. I will guide you through it. He paused, then added more quietly. Carlos, whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that you have already exceeded every expectation I had. You have grown more in 3 months than most students grow in 3 years. I'm proud of you. Those words steadied Carlos more than anything else could have. Victor Hoffman was not a man who gave praise easily. Coming from him, those words meant everything. The concert began. Victor Hoffman performed several solo pieces first. He played with the mastery that had made him famous across Europe. The audience was transported, entranced by his artistry. Carlos watched from the wings, both inspired and intimidated. Then came the intermission. When the second half began, a stagehand wheeled out a second piano. The audience murmured with curiosity. This had not been listed in the program. Victor Hoffman walked onto the stage and addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to do something different tonight. I am going to perform a duet with one of my students. 3 months ago, this young man had never received a single formal music lesson. He taught himself to play piano by listening through walls and practicing in secret after everyone else had gone home. Tonight, I want to show you what can happen when natural talent meets dedication and hard work. Please welcome Carlos Rodriguez. Carlos walked onto the stage. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The lights were bright and hot. The audience was a dark mass of faces. He could see his mother in the front row, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. He sat at his piano. Victor Hoffman sat at the other piano just a few feet away. Their eyes met. Hoffman nodded and Carlos nodded back. Victor Hoffman raised his hands and began to play the opening phrase of the Mozart duet. After 4 measures, Carlos joined in. For the first minute, Carlos was aware of everything. The lights, the audience, the fear. But then something magical happened. He began to hear only the music. He listened to what Victor Hoffman was playing and responded to it. When the maestro played a phrase, Carlos answered with his own. When their parts came together in harmony, it felt like 2 voices singing as one. The Mozart was full of life and energy and humor. There were moments of great beauty and moments of playful mischief. Carlos found himself smiling as he played. He glanced at Victor Hoffman and saw that the maestro was smiling too. Carlos did make mistakes. There were a few wrong notes. Once he came in half a beat too early and had to quickly adjust. But these small errors did not matter. What mattered was the communication between the 2 pianists, the sense of joy and partnership that filled the music. The final chords rang out, and Carlos and Victor Hoffman released the keys at exactly the same moment. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the audience erupted in applause. People stood up. Some were shouting, "Bravo!" Maria was crying openly, clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. Carlos stood and bowed, feeling dizzy with relief and happiness. Victor Hoffman came to stand beside him and put his arm around Carlos's shoulders, presenting him to the audience like a father presenting his son. As they walked off stage together, Victor Hoffman leaned close and said, "See? You did not need to be perfect. You just needed to be authentic." After the concert, people crowded around Carlos backstage. Some wanted to congratulate him. Others wanted to meet the student Victor Hoffman had spoken about so dramatically. Even Herr Schmidt approached, suddenly warm and friendly now that Carlos had been validated in front of Vienna's cultural elite. But the most important moment came when Maria finally reached her son. She wrapped her arms around him and held him tight, not caring that important people were watching or that her simple dress looked shabby next to their finery. "You were wonderful, mijo," she whispered. "Your father would have been so proud." Carlos held his mother and let himself cry. These were tears of relief, of joy, of release. 3 months ago he had been invisible. Tonight he had stood on the stage of the Vienna Concert Hall and made music with one of the greatest pianists in Europe. The path ahead was still long. He still had so much to learn. There would still be people who resented him and teachers who doubted him. But tonight Carlos Rodriguez had proven something important. He had proven that he belonged. The performance at the Vienna Concert Hall changed everything for Carlos. Overnight, he went from being the outsider whom everyone resented to being the student everyone was curious about. The newspapers wrote articles about the cleaning woman's son who had performed with the great Victor Hoffman. One writer called Carlos a diamond found in the rough, proof that genius can emerge from anywhere. But the attention brought new challenges. Some students became friendly toward Carlos, but he soon realized that many of them just wanted to be associated with his sudden fame. They invited him to study groups and social events, but their smiles felt false. Friedrich and his closest friends remained openly hostile, but they were more careful now. Victor Hoffman's public endorsement had given Carlos a protection he had not possessed before. The teachers at the conservatory changed their behavior as well. Professor Adler, who had been so dismissive of Carlos in theory class, now called on him regularly and praised his progress. The other instructors no longer made snide comments about his background. Carlos found this shift almost more uncomfortable than the earlier hostility. At least the hostility had been honest. The only person who treated Carlos exactly the same as before was Victor Hoffman. During their morning lessons, the maestro remained as demanding and critical as ever. If anything, he pushed Carlos even harder. The performance was adequate, Hoffman said during their first lesson after the recital. But adequate is not good enough. You have potential, but potential unrealized is just wasted opportunity. Now that people know your name, they will have expectations. You must work twice as hard to meet those expectations. Carlos did work harder. He practiced until his fingers were sore. He studied theory until he dreamed in chord progressions. He attended every masterclass and concert he could, absorbing knowledge like a sponge soaks up water. The conservatory library became his second home. He would sit for hours, studying scores by the great composers, analyzing their techniques, trying to understand what made their music immortal. 6 months after his public debut, Carlos was sitting in the library when he noticed a girl watching him. She was small and delicate, with red hair pulled back in a braid and intelligent green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had seen her around the conservatory before. Her name was Anna Brenner, and she was one of the violin students. "You are Carlos Rodriguez," she said, approaching his table. "Yes," Carlos replied, expecting her to ask for some favor or to want something from him because of his association with Victor Hoffman. But instead she said, "I heard you practicing yesterday. You were working on the Chopin Ballade No. 1. You played the coda section 12 times, and each time you stopped at the same measure. You were rushing the tempo there. May I show you something?" Carlos was surprised. No student had ever offered to help him before. "Please," he said. Anna pulled out a pencil and a sheet of music paper. She quickly sketched out the measure that had been troubling him. "The problem is that you are thinking about this phrase wrong. You are treating these notes as a single unit, so you accelerate through them. But if you break it into 2 smaller phrases and breathe between them, the tempo will naturally settle." She was right. Carlos looked at the notation she had drawn and immediately understood. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That is very helpful." Anna smiled. It was a genuine smile, not the fake friendliness he had gotten used to from others. "I know what it is like to struggle with something and have no one willing to help. Most students here are too competitive. They think that helping others somehow diminishes their own success. But I believe music is better when we share knowledge." From that day forward, Carlos and Anna became friends. She was the first real friend he had made at the conservatory. They would study together in the library, help each other with difficult passages, and attend concerts together. Anna came from a middle-class family. Her father was a doctor and her mother was a teacher. They were not wealthy like most conservatory families, but they were comfortable. Anna understood what it was like to be slightly outside the inner circle of privilege. Though her experience was nothing like Carlos's poverty, Anna also helped Carlos navigate the complex social world of the conservatory. She explained the unwritten rules and the subtle hierarchies. She warned him about which teachers were fair and which ones held grudges. She taught him how to deflect the jealousy of other students without creating enemies. "You have to understand," Anna told him one day, as they sat on a bench in the conservatory courtyard. "Most of these students have been groomed for success their entire lives. They have had every advantage. Then you appear with nothing and you succeed anyway. It threatens their entire worldview. They need to believe that their privilege earned them their place here. You prove that it did not. So what should I do?" Carlos asked. "Keep being yourself. Work hard, be humble. Eventually talent wins. The people who matter will recognize it. The others do not matter anyway." As the months passed, Carlos continued to grow as a musician. Victor Hoffman introduced him to more challenging repertoire. They worked on Rachmaninoff and Prokofiev, composers whose music demanded both technical mastery and deep emotional expression. Hoffman also began teaching Carlos about performance psychology, how to manage nerves, how to connect with an audience, how to recover from mistakes. "A concert is not about perfection," Hoffman told him. "Perfection is for recordings where you can do multiple takes. A live performance is about communication. It is about taking the audience on a journey with you. Small mistakes do not matter if the overall journey is compelling." In his second year at the conservatory, Carlos was required to give a solo recital. This was a standard part of the curriculum, something every student had to do. But for Carlos, it carried extra weight. People would be watching to see if his success with Victor Hoffman had been a fluke or the beginning of a real career. Carlos chose his program carefully. He would play Bach's Italian Concerto, which would showcase his developing technical control. He would play Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major, which would demonstrate his lyrical sensitivity, and he would end with Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, a virtuosic showpiece that would prove he could handle the most demanding music. The preparation was grueling. Victor Hoffman worked with him on every detail of every piece. Hand position for this phrase, pedaling for that section, how to voice this chord, how to shape that melody. Nothing was left to chance. Anna helped him prepare as well. She sat through his practice sessions, giving him feedback from the perspective of a listener. "That passage was too loud. I lost the melody line." Or, "That section felt rushed. Give it more space." Her observations were always honest and helpful. Carlos's mother came to hear him practice whenever she could spare time from her work. She would sit quietly in the back of the practice room, her eyes closed, a small smile on her face. Carlos knew she did not understand the technical aspects of what he was doing, but she understood the love and dedication he poured into every note. 2 weeks before the recital, disaster struck. Carlos was practicing the list, working on a particularly demanding passage that required large leaps across the keyboard. He pushed himself too hard, practicing for hours without proper breaks. A sharp pain shot through his right wrist. By the next morning, his wrist was swollen and he could barely move his fingers. Victor Hoffman was furious when he saw Carlos's injury.
"This is what happens when you practice like a fool."
Did I not teach you about proper technique? About taking breaks? About listening to your body? I am sorry, sir, Carlos said miserably. I just wanted to be ready. Ready? You will be ready for nothing if you ruin your hands. Hoffman took a deep breath, calming himself. Go see Dr. Brenner, Anna's father. He treats musicians. He will tell you what needs to be done. Dr. Brenner examined Carlos's wrist carefully. You have strained the tendons, he said. It is not serious, but you must rest completely for at least a week. No playing at all. Then gentle exercises for another week. I will give you some exercises to help with the healing. But my recital is in 2 weeks, Carlos protested. I cannot stop practicing now. If you do not stop now, you will do permanent damage, and Dr. Brenner said firmly. Then you will never play again. One recital is not worth your entire career. Do you understand? Carlos understood, but that did not make it easier. For a week, he sat in the practice rooms and watched other students play, unable to touch a piano himself. It was torture. He attended his lessons with Victor Hoffman, but they could only discuss music theoretically. He could not demonstrate what he had learned. Anna visited him every day, bringing him books about music history and theory to keep his mind occupied. Your fingers may be resting, she said, but your mind can keep working. Study the scores. Analyze the structure. Understanding the music intellectually will help when you can play again. When Carlos was finally allowed to play again, he had only 1 week before the recital. His wrist was still tender, and he had to rebuild his stamina carefully. Victor Hoffman created a modified practice schedule that would prepare him without risking further injury. You will not be at your best, Hoffman said bluntly, but you will be good enough. The important thing is that you get through this experience. Stage experience is valuable, even when the circumstances are not ideal. The night of the recital arrived. The hall was full. All the conservatory students and faculty were there. Maria sat in her usual place in the front row. Anna's family came to support both their daughter's friend and to see how Dr. Brenner's patient had recovered. Even some of the people who had heard Carlos perform with Victor Hoffman returned, curious to see how he would do on his own. Carlos walked onto the stage. His wrist was wrapped in a light bandage under his sleeve. His hands trembled slightly as he bowed to the audience. He sat at the piano and took several deep breaths. The box started well. The piece was not too physically demanding, and Carlos's fingers felt responsive. He made a few small mistakes, but he kept going, maintaining the flow of the music. When he finished the Bach, he felt a surge of confidence. He could do this. The Schubert was beautiful. This was the piece Carlos loved most in his program. It was tender and lyrical, full of gentle emotion. He poured his heart into it, forgetting about his injury, forgetting about the audience. For those few minutes, there was only the music and the piano and the story he was telling. The applause after the Schubert was warm and genuine. Carlos stood and bowed, feeling more relaxed. He had survived the first 2 pieces. 1 more to go, but the list was a different challenge. It was a long, demanding piece that required tremendous physical stamina and technical brilliance. Carlos started well, navigating the opening sections with confidence. But about halfway through, his wrist began to hurt. The pain was not severe, but it was there, a constant reminder of his injury. Carlos pushed through the pain, but it affected his playing. He missed a few notes in a rapid passage. A difficult leap was not quite clean. His left hand, overcompensating for his weaker right hand, began to tire. By the time he reached the famous ending section, Carlos was struggling. His wrist hurt badly now, and his fingers felt heavy and slow. But he refused to give up. He thought about all the obstacles he had overcome. He thought about his mother. sitting in the audience who had sacrificed so much for him. He thought about Victor Hoffman, who had taken a chance on an untrained boy. He thought about everyone who had said he did not belong here. Carlos gathered his remaining strength and attacked the final pages of the list with everything he had. The pain in his wrist was intense, but he ignored it. His fingers flew across the keyboard. The music rose to its triumphant conclusion, and Carlos struck the final chords with force and conviction. He released the keys and sat frozen, his chest heaving, his wrist throbbing. The audience erupted in applause. People stood up. Carlos stood and bowed, trying to smile, trying to look confident. But as he walked off the stage, the adrenaline that had carried him through the performance drained away and he felt suddenly exhausted. Victor Hoffman met him backstage. The maestro's expression was unreadable. "Your wrist?" he asked. "It hurts," Carlos admitted. "I know. I could see it in your playing. The list was not your best work, but you finished. That takes courage." Hoffman paused, then added, "You have learned an important lesson tonight. Pushing through pain may feel heroic, but it is often foolish. A smart musician knows when to protect themselves, even if it means disappointing an audience. Are you angry with me, sir? No. I am disappointed that you injured yourself through careless practice. But I am not angry. You are learning. Mistakes are part of learning. Just do not make the same mistake twice." Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed, Carlos sat alone in the empty recital hall. His wrist ached and his spirits were low. The performance had not been a disaster, but it had not been the triumph he had hoped for. He had proven he could perform, but he had also revealed his limitations. Anna found him there. She sat down beside him without speaking at first. Finally, she said, "You were brave tonight. Everyone could see you were in pain, but you kept going. That matters. I should have been smarter. I should have rested more before the injury happened. Probably. But you are 18 years old and learning. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether you learn from them." Carlos looked at his friend. "Thank you for helping me prepare. And thank your father for treating my wrist." "We help each other," Anna said simply. "That is what friends do." They sat together in the quiet hall, and Carlos realized something important. His journey was not about being perfect. It was not about never making mistakes or never facing setbacks. It was about perseverance, about learning, about growing. It was about having people who believed in him and helped him along the way. The path to becoming a great musician was long and difficult. But Carlos Rodriguez was no longer walking that path alone. 3 years had passed since Carlos first walked into the Vienna Conservatory as a student. 3 years of early morning lessons with Victor Hoffman, 3 years of grueling practice and difficult classes, 3 years of slowly earning respect from people who had once looked down on him. Now at 19 years old, Carlos stood at a crossroads in his musical journey. It was time for his graduation recital. This was not just another student performance. The graduation recital was the final test, the moment when students proved they were ready to become professional musicians. For Carlos, it carried even more significance. This would be his chance to show how far he had come from that night 3 years ago when he had played Moonlight Sonata with trembling hands in front of a hostile crowd. Victor Hoffman called Carlos to his studio one morning in early spring. The older man looked tired. He had been traveling frequently for concerts, and the strain was showing in his face. But his eyes were still sharp and focused. "Sit down, Carlos," Hoffman said. "We need to discuss your graduation recital." Carlos sat, feeling nervous. He had already been thinking about his program for weeks. "You have come very far," Hoffman continued. "When I first heard you play, you were raw and untrained. Now you are a skilled musician with solid technique and genuine artistry. But there is one more thing you need to learn before you can truly call yourself a complete pianist." "What is that, sir?" "You need to learn to be yourself." Hoffman leaned back in his chair. "For 3 years I have been molding you, shaping your technique, training your hands and your mind. That was necessary. But now you must find your own voice. Every great musician has a distinctive style, a unique way of interpreting music. You have been so focused on learning the right way to play that you have forgotten to discover your own way." Carlos frowned, confused. "But you taught me that there are correct techniques, proper interpretation, or... Yes, there are fundamentals that must be respected. But within those boundaries, there is infinite room for personal expression. 2 pianists can play the same piece with perfect technique, but one will move you to tears and the other will leave you cold. The difference is authenticity, personal truth." Hoffman stood and walked to the window. For your graduation recital, I want you to choose pieces that speak to your own story. Not pieces that will impress the critics. Not pieces that show off your technique. Pieces that reveal who Carlos Rodriguez truly is. This was a challenge Carlos had not expected. He had been planning to play the most difficult, impressive works he could manage. Now Victor Hoffman was asking him to do something much harder. To be vulnerable. To be honest. To be himself. Over the next few weeks, Carlos thought deeply about his program. He talked with Anna, who helped him understand what Hoffman meant. Think about your journey, she said. Where you came from. What music means to you. Choose pieces that connect to that story. Finally, Carlos decided on his program. He would begin with Bach's Goldberg variations, or at least a selection of them. Bach was mathematical and perfect, but also deeply spiritual. Carlos had always found comfort in Bach during his hardest times. The order and beauty of Bach's music had given him hope when everything else felt chaotic. For his second piece, Carlos chose Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 17, known as The Tempest. This was not the most famous Beethoven sonata, but it was Carlos's favorite. It was stormy and emotional, full of struggle and triumph. It reminded him of his own battles against doubt and prejudice. And for his final piece, Carlos made a bold choice. He would play an arrangement of traditional Spanish folk songs. These were the songs his mother had sung to him when he was a child, the melodies of his heritage. They were not sophisticated or impressive in the way conservatory audiences usually valued. But they were honest. They were him. When Carlos told Victor Hoffman his choices, the maestro smiled. It was a rare, genuine smile. Good. Now you're thinking like an artist. But I warn you, the Spanish folk songs will surprise people. Some will not understand. Some will think you are not taking the recital seriously. Are you prepared for that? Yes, sir. These songs are important to me. They deserve to be heard. Then play them with pride. The weeks leading up to the graduation recital were intense. Carlos practiced constantly but differently than before. He was not just trying to play notes correctly. He was trying to find the deeper meaning in every phrase to connect each piece to his own experience. The Bach became a meditation on order and faith. The Beethoven became an expression of his struggle and determination. The Spanish folk songs became a love letter to his mother and his roots. Maria had saved money for months to buy a new dress for the graduation recital. When Carlos saw her preparing for the concert, he felt tears come to his eyes. His mother had given up so much for him. She still worked as a cleaning woman at the conservatory, though the director had tried several times to fire her. Now that her usefulness in employing her son had passed, only Victor Hoffman's continued protection kept her employed. You are beautiful, Mama, Carlos said. Maria smiled and touched her son's cheek. And you are everything I dreamed you could be, mijo. Your father would be so proud. I wish he could have lived to see this day. The night of the graduation recital arrived. The Vienna concert hall was filled to capacity. All of Carlos's classmates were there, including Friedrich, who would graduate the same year. Anna sat with her family, giving Carlos an encouraging smile. The conservatory faculty filled several rows, and scattered throughout the audience were people from Vienna's musical community who had heard about the cleaning woman's son and wanted to see what he would become. Victor Hoffman sat alone in a box seat, watching everything with his usual intense focus. Carlos spotted him and they exchanged a brief nod. Carlos walked onto the stage wearing the finest clothes he had ever owned. Victor Hoffman had insisted on buying him a proper concert suit, saying that appearance mattered in the professional world. But Carlos wore something else as well, a small pin on his lapel that had belonged to his father. It was a simple thing made of cheap metal, but it connected him to his past. He sat at the piano and took a moment to center himself. The hall fell silent. Then Carlos began to play. The Bach was crystalline and perfect. Carlos played with mathematical precision, but also with warmth and humanity. Each variation was a small meditation, a moment of reflection. The audience listened with rapt attention. This was not showy or dramatic playing. It was pure, honest, and deeply moving. When the Bach concluded, there was a moment of silence before the applause began. Carlos stood and bowed, then sat again without leaving the stage. No break. He would play all three pieces without pause, taking the audience on a continuous journey. The Beethoven Tempest Sonata exploded into the silence. Where the Bach had been contemplative, the Beethoven was passionate and turbulent. Carlos played with controlled fury, channeling all the frustration and determination he had felt over the past 3 years. This was the sound of someone refusing to give up despite every obstacle. This was the sound of fighting for your dreams. The slow movement of the Beethoven was heartbreakingly beautiful. Carlos played it like a prayer, like a moment of peace in the middle of a storm. Some people in the audience were crying. This was not just technical skill. This was a young man's soul laid bare. The final movement returned to tempestuous energy, building to a powerful conclusion. The last chords rang out, and Carlos let them fade completely before moving directly into his final selection. The Spanish folk songs began simply. A gentle melody, a mother's lullaby. Carlos played it with tenderness and nostalgia. He thought of his mother sitting in the audience, of all the nights she had sung to him, of all the sacrifices she had made. The melody was simple, but Carlos played it with such love that it became profound. The songs continued, each one building on the last. A playful dance, a sad ballad, a triumphant celebration. These were not sophisticated concert pieces. They were the music of ordinary people, of workers and families, of his people, and Carlos played them with pride, claiming his heritage in front of this elite audience. Some people in the audience looked confused. This was not what they expected from a conservatory graduation recital. But others understood. Anna was crying. Maria was crying. And in his box seat, Victor Hoffman was nodding slowly, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. The final song was joyful and bright, a celebration of life and resilience. Carlos played it with his whole heart, and when the last notes faded, he stood and bowed deeply. For a moment, nothing happened. The audience seemed uncertain how to react. Then someone began to clap. Then another. Then the entire hall erupted in applause. People stood up. They cheered. The ovation went on and on. Carlos bowed again and again. He looked for his mother and saw her standing, tears streaming down her face, clapping harder than anyone. He looked for Anna and saw her beaming with pride. He looked for Victor Hoffman and saw the maestro standing in his box, applauding with dignity and approval. Carlos left the stage but was called back for multiple bows. Finally, the applause died down and people began to leave. But Carlos's journey was not over yet. Backstage, Victor Hoffman waited for him. The older man embraced Carlos, something he had never done before. "You have become the musician I hoped you would be," Hoffman said quietly. "Not just technically proficient, but artistically honest. You found your voice tonight. I learned from the best teacher, sir. Perhaps. But the real credit belongs to you. You took every difficulty and turned it into strength. You faced every doubt and proved it wrong. That is not something I could teach you. That came from inside you." Over the next hour, Carlos received congratulations from dozens of people. Professors who had once dismissed him now praised his performance. Fellow students who had been hostile now seemed genuinely impressed. Herr Schmidt made a point of telling Carlos that the conservatory was proud of him, conveniently forgetting that he had once tried to have Carlos expelled. But the most important moment came when Maria finally reached her son. She held him tightly, and Carlos let himself be small again for just a moment, let himself be the child who had needed his mother's comfort. "I am so proud of you," Maria whispered. "So proud I cannot even say it properly in words. I could not have done any of this without you, Mama. Every note I played tonight was because of your love and sacrifice." Anna approached with her family. Dr. Brenner shook Carlos's hand firmly. "That was extraordinary, young man. Truly extraordinary." Anna hugged Carlos. "You were perfect," she said. "Not technically perfect, but perfectly you. That is what mattered." As the crowd finally dispersed and the hall grew quiet, Carlos found himself alone on the stage one last time. He sat at the piano and played a single soft chord, then released it and listened to it fade into silence. 3 years ago, he had stood in the main hall of the conservatory, terrified and defiant, daring to touch a piano that people said was not for someone like him. Tonight, he had graduated from one of Europe's finest music schools with honors. He had proven that talent and dedication could overcome poverty and prejudice. But Carlos knew his journey was just beginning. Graduation was not an ending. It was a doorway to a new chapter. He would face new challenges, new doubts, new obstacles. The professional music world was competitive and often cruel. But he was ready. Victor Hoffman appeared one last time that night. He handed Carlos an envelope. "Open it tomorrow," the maestro said. "It contains a letter of recommendation and some opportunities I have arranged for you. There are 3 concert invitations, an audition with a major orchestra, and an introduction to an agent who handles rising pianists. What you do with these opportunities is up to you. But you have earned the chance. Thank you, sir, for everything. You changed my life." "No, Carlos. I simply gave you the opportunity to show the world what was already inside you. The rest was your doing." Hoffman turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Your mother should not have to clean floors anymore. I have arranged a position for her as an administrative assistant at the conservatory. Better pay, better hours, more respect. She has earned it by raising such a remarkable son." With that, Victor Hoffman walked away, leaving Carlos standing alone in the empty concert hall with tears running down his face. The next morning, Carlos opened the envelope. Inside, along with the letter of recommendation and the opportunities Victor Hoffman had mentioned, was a newspaper clipping. It was a review of his graduation recital. The headline read, "From cleaning halls to concert halls, Carlos Rodriguez proves that talent knows no boundaries." The review was glowing, but what struck Carlos most was the final paragraph. Rodriguez's choice to end his recital with Spanish folk songs was either brilliant or foolish, depending on your perspective, but it was undeniably authentic. In a world where young pianists too often sound like copies of each other, Rodriguez has found his own voice. That voice speaks of struggle and triumph, of honoring one's roots while reaching for the stars. It is a voice we will be hearing for years to come. Carlos folded the newspaper carefully and put it in a drawer with the pin that had belonged to his father and the first program from when he had performed with Victor Hoffman. These were his treasures, more valuable than money or fame. 5 years later, Carlos Rodriguez stood backstage at the Vienna Concert Hall, preparing for his solo debut concert as a professional pianist. He had spent those 5 years building his career, playing in smaller venues, studying with other great teachers, developing his repertoire. Now he was finally ready for this moment. Before he walked onto the stage, Carlos thought about that night long ago when he had first touched the grand piano and Victor Hoffman had caught him. If someone had told him then what his life would become, he never would have believed it. But here he was, no longer the scared boy in patched clothes, no longer invisible or overlooked. He was Carlos Rodriguez, pianist, artist, and musician. And tonight, in front of a sold-out audience, he would tell his story through music. His mother sat in the front row, as always. She no longer wore the clothes of a cleaning woman. She wore the dignified dress of a working professional, because that was what she had become. Beside her sat Victor Hoffman, now retired from performing but still teaching. And beside him sat Anna, who had become not just Carlos's friend but his partner in music and in life. Carlos walked onto the stage. The applause was warm and welcoming. He bowed, then sat at the piano. He placed his hands on the keys, closed his eyes for just a moment, and remembered. He remembered listening through walls. He remembered secret practice sessions late at night. He remembered the moment he decided to defy everyone's expectations and reach for the piano that they said was not for him. He remembered Victor Hoffman's harsh lessons and gentle wisdom. He remembered his mother's love and sacrifice. He remembered every step of the impossible journey that had brought him here. Then Carlos opened his eyes, raised his hands, and began to play.